Dear listeners, I take great pride in offering you an access to Chinese medicine. We know all that Chinese medicine has something to offer for all the patients and also the therapists, because they can ameliorate their perspective on human functions and be more helpful. Now, we are all interested now in how Chinese medicine works. So, I would love to explain to you a little bit of what I've found out over the last 30 years during my journey with Chinese medicine. The first important thing is that you understand the terminology, the key terms, the technical terms of Chinese medicine well. Listen. Dear listeners, we all know Chinese medicine can be very helpful for patients and can also offer a professional perspective for therapists. Now, we are all interested in how Chinese medicine actually functions, how it works, how we can understand it. Well, let me take you by the hand and lead you a little bit to those perspectives that we gained through the last 30 years of research on that very topic. If you want to have a closer look at Chinese medicine, you must definitely understand the core termini, yin, yang, and the phases. So, let us have a closer look at these termini in the sense of technical terms. And when I say technical terms, I mean that we are not speaking of a fluffy philosophy or something, but we speak of technical categories to allocate the phenomena of life. The original meaning of yin and yang can be deducted from the shape of their emblems. So far, we know that yin and yang originally refer to a mountain with its sunnier and relative shadier side. So, along with this goes some allocation of functions and functional features of that same mountain. We all know, for instance, that lighter is a meaning of yang in comparison to yin, shadier or darker. We all know that higher is one abstract meaning of yang as it is closer to the sun, whereas yin means lower in comparison to what the term yang means. Also, we know that if we go to a skiing region, for instance to the Alps, that if you have a mountain with a ski hut and you want to go and have a beer, there is two sides of that very skiing hut that you can very well differentiate. For instance, one side of the skiing hut would be in the sun. Normally that's where the people gather. So one could say one metaphor of yang is more life, more liveliness, more activation. Whereas in the shadier side you may want to store the beer and the wood. So that is actually the less active side. So yang can mean more active in comparison to yin, less active. Listen, I said more active and less active because actually it is a comparative form. Yang does not mean light, but it means lighter. It does not mean lively, but livelier, and so forth. So, also, you could say that in the sun it is a little warmer. So warmer is yang in comparison to colder, which is yin. Then, when you enter the house, you will see that it's normally in the shade. Therefore, the inside is yin in comparison to the outside, which is yang. Also, this volume that you enter, the physical body of that house, would be the yin, and the dependent functions and functional features are the yang, the function which develops by the cause that there is a house. Well, this is all relatively simple, but there is one meaning of yin and yang that is less known. It is the meaning that yin and yang are actually also binary numbers. Well, you may think that this is maybe a fantasy of a Westerner. Well, it is not. Some almost 300 years ago, the famous book I Ching reached the West and came into the hands of a young mathematician whose name is Leibniz. Now we will find out what Leibniz read and discovered within this I Ching. It obviously already contained binary numbers. Well, you could say, well, if one book contains a bit about binary numbers, why should we care about it? Well, scientists very often refer to the oldest sources of which they can find. The oldest sources from which we can learn about the meaning of yin and yang besides mere emblems are actually the oldest books. And the oldest book of mankind, and therefore also the oldest book in which we can read of yin and yang, is the I Ching. So let's see what Leibniz found. Well, Leibniz actually was not only a mathematician, he was also a philosopher. His most famous work is called Theodicee, and you see the front page of this book. What he discovered is that you can form numbers by 1 and 0, and it is obvious that he may have taken this idea from this very I Ching. To make clear what we speak of, we could refer to some picture that we have in the I Ching already. See, that is yang, a light bar, and this represents yin, a dark bar. So this is like 1 and 0. If you combine these monograms or signs of one component to bigrams, you reach with at signs which have 2 components. And if you combine these, you get numbers like yang yin, yang yang, yin yang, and yin yin. And these numbers are comparable to 1 to 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, you could even go so far as to take 3 of these grams, these elements, and then you have trigrams representing the numbers 1 to 8. Now, what is this good for? So far, we only see that these numbers exist. And Leibniz, as you have seen before, used it and even said, well, you can numerate, but you can also calculate with these numbers, and he writes it down about 300 years from now in the past. So, these are the numbers, and now see what they're good for. They were originally used from the I Ching's times to divide circles. And these circles then have, for instance, by bigrams, the numbers 1 to 4, or 4 pieces of cake. So, this is comparable to a compass. Therefore, this is also called the kind of the compass rod, the compass rose to write this emblem. And you see that allocated to these 4 parts here, you find a circular process like spring, summer, autumn and winter, the seasons of the year. But you can also allocate the circular position of the sun during the day, east, south, west, north, as at night the sun is under us and a little bit in the north. So you could also use an 8-part cycle, and there it is in the original of Leibniz himself. You might now be interested in why this is so very interesting. And actually, that is our key question. If you go a little further, you could use these numbers and these circular process models to describe something that we call regulation. So let us perform a virtual experiment. This is a water basin, and there is an electric heater and a thermostat. So, as you see, this is a very unromantic, unphilosophical kind of usage. As I said, yin and yang are technical categories besides their philosophical meaning. In medicine, however, the technical meaning is seemingly more important than the philosophical meaning. So the thermostat you can adjust to a target value. Whenever the target value has been reached, the thermostat says no current to the electric heater, and by that the heating process will be stopped. So we will reach approximately a similar temperature. Let's have a closer look on this very process. This process is a little bit similar to what we observe when we come to the lab in the morning. It is similar because we have incubators in the lab. So let's say the incubator should be fixed for the target value of 37 degrees. But when we enter, it's normally room temperature much lower. So when we switch on the whole system, you see the dotted line which represents that the temperature will rise. The temperature is room temperature, it's lower than 37 degrees. That's why the thermostat allows current to go into the heater and the temperature rises. But at this very point here, there is something very surprising. The temperature leads to the thermostat cutting off the current. But there is a little remainder of heat in this heater. See that? It's comparable to what happens in kitchen. When you turn off the stove, there is still some warmth in the plate. So better don't touch it. And that's why there is a little bit more heat that comes, and the temperature rises more than it actually should. Then, when you go down with this temperature, you see that you reach temperatures lower than target value. And that means the thermostat will switch on the heater again, but like in the kitchen, you will observe that there is a little latency until the plate gets hot. So, therefore, you see that there is a little low after the high. So this is after heat and this is latency. And this will now go on and on and on until you always have this little wave-like movement. Well, you might say, what has this wave to do with circular processes? Well, maybe you have heard at school that such so-called sinus waves, and this is roughly a sinus wave mathematically, that these represent circles. And maybe you want to know why that is the case. Well, just imagine a pipe organ player. You know these people that walk around the street and they have a circular movement of the hand. Here is the axis. And then they have the music going. Well, When you see the circular movement from that side, you will see it's an up and down. But when the pipe organ player walks on, you see that this is roughly a sinus wave. Actually, that means that this sinus wave is actually a circle. And that is why we can use these yin-yang signs to describe this circular movement. See, in later times, about the 3rd pre-Christian century, the terms yin-yang, yang-yang, yang-yin, and yin-yang were more and more replaced by the emblems that we call wood, fire, metal, and water. So these are also named elements sometimes, which is more or less suitable. It is actually visible here that there are just phases of a circular movement that we can describe, by which we can describe regulation. Therefore, it is necessary to point out yin and yang are regulatory terms, and these terms can be specified if you combine them. Bigrams, yin-yangs, therefore form these phases. Phases are therefore parts of the circular process, but they're also regulatory terms. Some people may now argue that this is a crazy idea of a Westerner, but let us see the following. We have already pointed out that this movement is circular, and a circular movement is defined by the axis, in this case the shall be value. Therefore, whenever the hand of the pipe organ player is up here, it will be torn down by the axis. When it is down here, it will be torn up by the axis. Actually, that is down regulation and up regulation. Let us stress now and emphasize the importance of the axis by these 2 dots. Now, if you were Chinese, and the Chinese are the world champion in emblem making, then you would maybe try to get an emblem that symbolizes the circular nature, the sinus wave, and the importance of the sinus wave. This is the so-called Fu Chi sign, which is also called the Tai Chi sign. This Tai Chi sign, or the Fu Chi sign, or the monad as Leibniz called it, therefore represents the idea that yin and yang and the phases are one system. It symbolizes that there are regulatory terms by which you can describe the phenomena of life as a regulatory process. Well, also man is regulated to a certain degree. So if you take the general vegetative activity of a person as a regulated issue, then you can see that there is a possibility to describe regulation by this curve. Down here you have all this concert of mechanisms and transmitters that symbolize and affect actually that cause the up and down regulation. So a Western scientist would describe this phenomenon as a concert of transmitters. However, you can see the consequences, the clinical consequences, as patterns of signs that are displayed here as figurines. These signs are sometimes referred to as organ patterns, and we will have to see how this takes place. Well, in the beginning we have in our description 4 of these organ patterns. But these organ patterns also show us, if you like, the energy, the ability to work within the system. Even there is a pattern for down-regulation and for up-regulation. So you can read my clinical signs whether the so-called stomach is active, which is this vector, or the lionel pattern, the spleen pattern, is active. Therefore, in the beginning, we have 4 parts of a cycle that can be observed by key signs. Signs that you can learn by heart, or signs that you can actually also understand. In addition to these 4 signs, we see that the axis can upregulate and downregulate. So you have 6 patterns or groups of signs. Traditionally, these groups are called circles of signs, functional circles, or Latin orbs, from orbis, the circle. In later periods of Chinese medicine, we would even be able to form an 8-parted cycle. So you would have 8 parts of the sinus wave as 8 parts of the cycle. Then you would have trespasses that are between these original 4 + 2 patterns. Then this adds up to a system of 8 orbs or 8 organ patterns plus 2 for the phase Earth or the axis. This principle that Chinese medicine allocates human functions to circular processes, and here, as you see, to regulation, has been kept on. So we have a 4-parted cycle with 4 phases, and we can divide up the phases in halves. So you have the young wood and the old wood, the young fire and the old fire, the young metal and the old metal, and the young water and the old water. You can also express that as organ patterns. This is because the Chinese believed that the functional patterns that we would address to as vegetative patterns have something to do with parts of the body, parts in which the respective organ would be located. There is therefore a liver pattern and a gallbladder pattern, or a heart or a small intestine pattern. And we can easily figure out why these regions of the bodies were allocated to the signs that indicate the status of regulation.